An involuntary twitch ran through my face. I am not a hero, I kept telling her. It's a stupid thing to be. That's a smart philosophy, he replied. I wished he would get angry at me rather than just sit there among the bin bags being cheerfully reasonable. Slippery John knows no fear, of course, but Slippery John could see how it wouldn't appeal these days, with the guild and the syndrome and everything. Slippery John has too much heroism in the blood to do anything else, but it might be too much positive press if you ask Slippery John. Right, I said doubtfully. Of course, Slippery John reckons there's a difference between hero and protagonist. So pretty much everybody who's ever glanced in the general direction of a creative writing class has heard the phrase, write what you know. And anybody who's stuck around has probably heard endless debate on if that's good advice or not, or what it even means in the first place. For me personally, I like to turn that into know what you write, i.e. do research, listen to people who know things, explore the areas unknown to you before writing about them. Keep an open mind, try to be empathetic, understand your privileges, and for God's sakes, men, ask a woman what sex is like from her perspective before you even consider writing a sex scene. But for a lot of amateur writers, write what you know seems to read as only write about stuff that you have personal experience in, even though most of us haven't had a best-selling novel kind of life, especially those still in school. Of course, there are exceptions. One obscure book I rather like is Seven Hills City by Brandon Stroud, a tale of love, death, religion, and professional wrestling that, through personal conversations I've had with the author, is about 90% autobiographical, just with the names changed and a spattering of magical realism near the end. But Stroud is such an immensely passionate and evocative writer that even the protagonist is doing the late shift at the grocery store stuff is interesting. That's largely the opposite to another Write What You Know book, Mogworld by Yahtzee Croshaw. This fantasy novel stars Jim, a magic student who's been dead for 60 years before being resurrected as a zombie by the evil necromancer Lord Dreadgrave. It's a pretty sweet gig all told. Good benefits, a positive workplace, plenty of adventurers trying to raid the place for Jim and his fellow zombies to maim and kill. But then, out of the blue, a swarm of angel-like beings fly in and delete Dreadgrave, delete his castle and his entire operation. With a couple of his fellow zombie survivors, Jim treks out into the wider world to discover that a lot has been going wrong. Nobody is staying dead. When somebody dies, their soul is placed into a fresh body at the nearest church. People are contracting a disease that paralyzes them in dramatic poses, and a small-town priest suddenly has godlike abilities and is destroying villages for no discernible reason. And Jim couldn't care less. He rather liked being dead all those years ago, his soul existing as pure energy in a paradise realm. His goal in all of this craziness is to find a way to kill himself. If he has to solve all the world's problems to do so, so be it. Those problems, it turns out, are a bit more meta than expected. You see, Jim isn't actually a zombie wizard living in a land of dungeons, dragons, and orcs. He's a character in a video game, an NPC in a simulated fantasy world whose characters have suddenly become self-aware. The angel creatures and their godlike acts are the hands of the real-world programmers trying to work out the bugs. This probably seems like a big, late-in-the-book twist that I just spoiled, but not only is this hinted at very strongly early in the book, it's pretty much given away by the marketing.
So basically, he's a non-player character, or NPC, in a sophisticated near-future MMORPG, where the AI has become self-aware. That's not really a spoiler. That's more or less the starting position of the book. Just the plot goes lots of places from there.
Mogworld spoofs on generic fantasy a little bit, spoofs on Dungeons & Dragons a little bit, but it's mostly spoofing on World of Warcraft, the most iconic online fantasy game ever. The way people are resurrected in this world matches Warcraft's mechanics. There are play zones that are cordoned off by invisible walls. There are adventurers who ask for quests and then are paid off in points instead of money. A list of heroic poses to choose from. Mogworld's book cover evokes Warcraft's box art, and the Mog in the title is a shortened version of MMORPG, or Massively Multiplayer Online Role-Playing Game. So really, the title of the book is Multiplayer Online Game World. It's not subtle, is my point. So this book is a genre mashup, a classic fantasy meeting science fiction artificial intelligence ideas. So why do I think this is a Write What You Know book? For that, we're going to have to get into the life and career of Ben Yahtzee Croshaw. Now, if you know Yatzhee from anything, that would be Zero Punctuation, a weekly video game review series that began in 2007 and is still going strong to this day. Zero Punctuation is known for a simple art design that includes no video game footage, a rapid-fire delivery, and a big spoonful of caustic humor. Yatzhee knows how to throw an insult.
This manages to out Assassin's Creed, although that's not hard because in comparison most Assassin's Creeds are about as balanced as the arm strength of a professional masturbator. Why must we forever carry our failures around with us like a scrotum full of horseshoes? Which at least didn't crash, even if the frame rates kept dropping and it still had more clipping issues than an arthritic hairdresser.
But we'll get back to Zero Punctuation, as it's hardly the only thing he's done. Yahtzee been developing games since 1998. Primarily adventure games and action puzzle games, 18 in total so far. Sure, none of them are MMOs, but that's more game development experience than most of us can claim. A video game critic, a video game designer, probably no surprise that he's pretty invested in video games, and for a time made a pretty dedicated run on World of Warcraft.
I may have given some subtle hints in the past that I've played WoW before, subtle hints such as an entire fucking book, published by Dark Horse, available on Amazon. Buy now, beat the rush. Way before all your newfangled burning crotch saids and wraths of the bitch queen, I levelled an undead mage up to level 58 in vanilla caffeine-free World of Warcraft over the course of about 3 months, during which I was about as productive as a dead dog nailed to an armchair.
But what of Yahtzee's literary inspirations? Well, if you ask him, he'll give you a pretty substantial list of British humorists from the last 40 years.
Well, growing up, I read a lot of British human fantasy writers, P.G. Wodehouse, Robert Rankin, Tom Holt, Tom Sharp, Neil Gaiman. For a period in my teenage years, I refused to read anything other than Terry Pratchett books because I was a stupid little shit. But I think my very first influence was Douglas Adams. I think I've been trying to write novels ever since I first read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy when I was 8 years old. Precociously, I thought I could follow in his footsteps.
Hey, didn't Terry Pratchett also write a book about the characters in a computer game becoming self-aware? But yes, I can definitely see the Douglas Adams in Mogworld. Jim the Undead Mage is pretty close to Arthur Dent in temperament and scenario. Both are the boring everyman protagonists, suddenly thrust into adventure when destructive, powerful beings upend their concept of reality. They discover that the world they thought they knew was actually an elaborate simulation. Exasperated and stuck with a bunch of eccentric misfits, both protagonists are given a chance to return to the mundane existence they once inhabited. But will they? The primary difference between Jim and Arthur Dent is that Jim is knowledgeable and competent in this extremely odd setting. Jim is not an outsider who doesn't know how the world works. He's not clueless. He's capable to make his own decisions and comes up with his own plans. Arthur Dent doesn't understand anything and is stuck following the whims of the people around him. Imagine if Arthur Dent was an experienced intergalactic pilot who knew what the Hitchhiker's Guide was and already had a babblefish and was proficient in towel techniques, and the plot of the book remained the same. In order to balance that out, to have a competent protagonist dragged about adventures he wants no part of, you would have to make them incredibly apathetic. There I stood, abandoned by my colleague, by some associates, alone at a darkened crossroad with only a wheelbarrow full of catatonic adventurer to keep me company. It was fairly obvious what was going to happen next. Somewhere in the distance, a wolf would howl, a cold wind would blow across the hills, the sudden unpleasant knowledge of being totally alone would creep over me like fast-growing fungus. Within a minute, I realized that for all my talk, I really had valued the company of Merrill and maybe even the dipshit priest. Within 2 minutes, I'd be pelting down the road to New Pillock after them. In the distance, a wolf howled. A cold wind blew across the hills. I picked up my wheelbarrow and took the road to Yonbor, whistling. Mogworld is an immensely cynical book with a very apathetic protagonist. Jim is constantly finding people who have causes to be passionate about in this weird new world of immortality. Fellow zombie Meryl, the closest thing Jim has to a friend, wants to rise a long overdue rebellion. A former Dark Lord has gone underground to figure out the origins of this immortality. A king steps away from his duties to lead a city in war against a mad demigod. And Jim couldn't give a flying fuck about any of it. His interest in what's going on in his world only goes so far as to what might be able to serve his own ends. He wants to end the curse of immortality not because he cares about the rest of the world, but because he wants to die. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Apathetic protagonists are fine, but they usually go hand in hand with some kind of character journey. For example, in Star Wars, Han Solo is largely apathetic towards the larger conflict between the Imperials and the Rebel Alliance. He's just in it for the money and the protection that money will bring him. However, after spending some time with our heroes, rubbing shoulders with people who do care, and gaining a greater understanding of the larger conflict, Han begins to doubt his selfish convictions, and when all hope seems lost, he flies in at the last minute to save the day, and the theater goes wild. But Mogworld has zero interest in having this kind of moment, where Jim finally steps up and starts caring. He even straight up betrays his allies and doesn't feel all that bad about it. Jim is alone, and he wouldn't have it any other way. Cynicism is the foundation of pretty much every one of Yahtzee's projects, including Zero Punctuation, whose humor largely lies on whatever Barbie insults Yatzhee can come up with this time around. This means a preference towards negative reviews, and early on, any attempt at positivity were stamped out by the viewers.
If my Psychonauts review taught me anything, it's that nobody likes me when I'm being nice to a game, so let me quickly get the praise for Bioshock out of the way first.
Zero Punctuation has had positive reviews since, but they have to be couched in the negative witticisms that the brand has become known for. And there's been very little variance or growth. An episode of Zero Punctuation from 2007 feels nearly identical to an episode from 2019, the only changes being the aspect ratio and less copyrighted music. The cynicism has stayed the same. But I get it. Cynicism and apathy was cool in the first decade of the 21st century. South Park and their libertarian, if you care about anything, you're an idiot messaging was at the height of their popularity. George Carlin reached the peak of his cranky grandpa rants. That new atheist thing happened that was all about pointing out how dumb religious people are. And in the world of internet reviewing, larger-than-life personalities screaming and cursing into the camera about media became the winning formula. The angry video game nerd, Angry Joe, the irate gamer. And where there's loud cussing and a general lack of empathy, that usually means a lot of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, you get the idea. And by the way, I'm not excluding myself from this. If you go back to my earliest videos, I use some words that I would never say now. And I had a negative attitude at times that I try to keep in check these days. Over the past 10 years, I've come to find joy and empathy and would rather talk about things in a positive light, or, barring that, in a constructive light. And I know a lot of people who have grown out of their 2007 mindset. Mogworld is very much an artifact of the cynical 2000s, though thankfully it's largely devoid of racism or homophobia. Insults towards overweight people, on the other hand? I had passed on from life, from the world of struggles and hardship and big fat women with annoying laughs, and entered a glorious new existence of utter peace and joy and love. I might have been surrounded by stupid people and arrogant people and fat people, but you don't need to put up with any of that crap forever. But, 2010 was gonna 2010. Hey, Yatzhee released a book called Differently Morphous just last year. Let's see what that one's about. A magical serial killer is on the loose, and gelatinous, otherworldly creatures are infesting the English countryside, which is making life for the Ministry of Occultism difficult because magic is supposed to be their best-kept secret. On the trail of the killer are the Ministry's top agents, a junior operative with a photographic memory and not much else, a couple of overgrown schoolboys with godlike powers, and a demonstrably insane magician. But as they struggle for results, their superiors at HQ must face the greatest threat the Ministry has ever known, The forces of political correctness. Oh, God. Never mind. When I said Zero Punctuation hasn't changed in 12 years, that includes that 2007 cynicism and apathy. That's the Yatzhee brand, and any attempts to step away from it resulted in pushback from his viewer base. And Yatzhee has had no problem delivering that cynicism. With his simple art design that allows for copy and pasted assets, little variety in humor, and a consistent, reliable release schedule. Oh my god, Zero Punctuation is the Garfield of internet video criticism.
How dare you oppress me? I identify as someone who isn't oppressive.
Humor is subjective, so saying I didn't laugh once at Mogworld isn't really helpful review. But I can say that if you've grown out of South Park, if you've grown out of New Atheism, if you've grown out of the angry, shouty people on YouTube, then you've already grown out of Mogworld. Its use these days is as a window to Yahtzee Croshaw. One part fanfiction of his World of Warcraft character, one part commentary on video game development, and 100% the apathy that brought him success. He wrote what he knew. Doesn't mean it's worth reading.